thank you so much for those kind introductions, and thank you all so much for coming. I really appreciate the turnout. As a book author, you never know. And I was in Chicago last week and spoke at a couple of clubs there, and they were good turnouts. And I spoke at a bookstore too; it was pretty good. But there was at the bookstore turnout, there were some people sort of hovering in the doorway when I got up, and I noticed that some of them sort of melted away. And I asked afterwards, I said, "Who are those people in the back?" She said, "Well, they thought that you were going to be Michelle Obama." And so they were under the impression that she had written this book, and that but bless her heart, one of them did actually stay. She actually sat down and listened the whole time, and she asked some questions, and she bought a book at the end. So anyway, I hope no one was here under the expectation that I would be Michelle Obama, but I'm very grateful to you for inviting me, and I appreciate your saying that it's a balanced book. Obviously, I'm here in a nonpartisan capacity as a journalist. And I thought I wanted to thank my mom for coming up from Richmond. And I also, since she's here, wanted to thank one of your members, Nell Minow, who is a wonderful friend of mine and whose father, good. Her father, Newton Minow, was an early mentor of Barack Obama, and her father and her mother, Jo, and her sister, Martha, who was his law professor, were so helpful to me, and I'm very grateful to the whole Minow family for their help. So I thought I'd talk a little bit about when Michelle Obama first sort of appeared on my radar screen as a journalist. Last summer for the Washington Post magazine, I was writing an analysis of Barack Obama's political rise. And during the course of that reporting, I interviewed Barack Obama and Michelle Obama and members of her family and members of their staff as well. And I also happened to interview a political donor in New Hampshire who was, as people in New Hampshire do, was taking very seriously her job of vetting all of the Democratic candidates. And I called her up to see what she thought, or to see what her thoughts were. And she was talking, she was undecided at that point, but she had met most of the Democratic candidates, and she was talking about Barack Obama and her thinking. And part of her thinking involved what I think Nicholas Kristof in the New York Times talked about, the rebranding of America. She was of the view that to elect Barack Obama would change the way that America was viewed in the world, and that was that was one of the sort of positive attributes in her thinking. She also liked the fact that he was very nice to her children and remembered their names, which really struck her. And she also started talking about Michelle Obama, and she said that she had watched Barack Obama in a debate, and after the debate he turned to greet his wife, and she said that she was so moved by the tableau on the stage, and she said, he's not a descendant of slaves, but she is. And she said, I think if he were elected, it would be a remarkable moment in American history. So to this political donor, Michelle Obama was of interest not only for herself and her own personality, but because of what she would represent in terms of American history. And that comment struck me, and I quoted her in the piece, and it sort of stayed with me. And then in the winter, I was contacted by an editor at Simon & Schuster who felt that Michelle Obama was of substantial interest to voters, and that the readers might welcome a chance to sit down and get to know her better in a book before the election, because by that time in the winter she was much higher on everybody's radar screen, and she had become sort of known first for her comments about her husband, which tend to be sort of funny and pointed and sort of pointing out his domestic haplessness, and I think those comments appealed very much. I have a colleague who thinks that they're quite hilarious and loves her kind of "take my husband please" shtick that she does. And obviously she had received criticism for that as well from Maureen Dowd, who felt that it diminished him in some way. And then, of course, she had become controversial as well for her the bad day she had in February when she made the comment about, "This is the first time in my adult life I felt really proud of my country because her husband's doing so well and people seem to want change." That was what she said. And she, that was, I think, the beginning of opponents of her husband feeling that Michelle Obama offered a sort of potential other means of attack, and she had become increasingly controversial February, March, April. several conservative writers were following her around, and there was an article in the in one of the magazines that referred to as Mrs. Grievance. So she was interesting to me because in the polls, her favorability ratings tended to be quite high, and her unfavorability ratings also tended to be high. And so she had become something of a polarizing figure. And I've written in the past about polarizing political figures. They often tend to be female. And I think that generally when people are that polarizing, it says something not only about them, but about our own culture and the way that people are reacting to whatever they think this person represents. She was also interesting to me just for a personal reason. As Marlene said, I was at Princeton University 3 years. I started 3 years before she did, and so I had some awareness of the landscape that she had spent time in there. And obviously, her Princeton thesis as well was a subject of much scrutiny, particularly from opponents who were picking over it and sort of plucking out sentences here and there. And I know something about the circumstances under which senior theses are produced. I still have anxiety dreams about my thesis. And, the chapter that's written at the last minute or the paragraph that's inserted because your advisor said something and you didn't quite understand it, but you think since your advisor be grading it, you should go and put it in. And the idea that 25 years later, your thesis would be scanned into, into a computer and then posted on the internet. My first thought was, I'm so glad my husband will never run for president and I'll never run for president and my thesis will never be posted online. And so I felt a certain kinship. And also, because we are of roughly the same generation, I think like many women of my generation, we find her interesting because she's had to cope with an extreme version of what many of us have coped with, in the sense that she graduated with basically the same credentials as her husband and the same career aspirations, and their careers moved along pretty much the same path. And then, lo and behold, they have 2 young children, and he gets this job promotion to the U.S. Senate, and she's the one, trying to hold things together and maintain some semblance of a career of her own, and also raise their young children and keep the household together. I have a friend here in Washington who's an attorney, and her husband's an attorney as well, and his job always seems to require more hours than hers does and take him away, and she refers to him as the visitor. And they've got kids about the same age as the Obamas, and I sometimes think that Michelle Obama may have thought of her husband as the visitor as well. And also, she's profoundly interesting because her own life story and also her family's narrative is a really classic African-American narrative and an important part not only of African-American history but of American history. And the more that I learned about her life story, the more I felt moved by by what her own family had overcome, and just very interested to see this story brought into the public, more into the public domain. And I know she has often said about this candidacy that she hopes, if nothing else, it presents to the public yet another image of African Americans and African American women in particular. She said that she feels the media presents African Americans mostly as either poverty-stricken or as celebrities or as athletes, and simply to have a functional professional person in the public eye, she feels is of use. So I thought I would talk a little bit about her family origins and her formative years, and then I'll take questions. If you want to ask questions more about the sort of contemporary part of her narrative, I'll be glad to answer any questions. But I thought I would talk about the formative years, because I also came to think of her as a person who had spent a lot of time on what I came to think of as contested terrain. One of her conservative critics in a magazine article made the point that she was born in 1964. The Civil Rights Act was signed 6 months after she was born, and this person was saying, she's not like Condoleezza Rice or somebody who grew up, in officially segregated America. Most of her life was spent in sort of post-Civil Rights America, so what's the problem, really? And I think, and it certainly became clear to me through this reporting that she benefited from many opportunities that were opening up after 1964, but that's not to say that it was easy. And she was moving into terrain that had formerly been open only to white Americans, and certainly it was becoming open, but there were definitely people who were protesting her presence, and that presumably would have given her a very mixed experience during her formative years.